welcome. Hello, my name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the Director of Extreme History Project, and I'm so glad you're here with us tonight at the Extreme History Lecture Series. And for those of you who don't know what Extreme History is, we are a local nonprofit that brings history to the public in relevant ways. And we do that through this lecture series. We do that through historic walking tours during the warmer months. And we do that through workshops. We do historic house workshops, genealogy workshops, all sorts of different kinds of workshops and other fun programming. So I'm glad you're here tonight. We're so excited about this presentation by Dale. I do have a few business items to cover before we get to Dale, but I will be quick. So we have a few thank yous tonight. First and foremost, I want to thank the Museum of the Rockies and Angie Whitekirk, who's up in the back. Give a wave, Angie. She's usually not in here. I'll call her out tonight, but the Museum of the Rockies staff really helps us put on this lecture series, so we're so thankful for that. We're thankful to be in this wonderful Hager Auditorium. So thanks to the Museum of the Rockies. We also want to thank the Gallatin Valley Community Radio folks because they come and record these lectures and then play them back on the radio on 95.9. That's the station on the dial if you're ever listening. And so they play them back on the radio, but then they also play them back on their website. So if you have a friend or a family member who couldn't make it here tonight, send them to Gallatin Valley Community Radio website, and they'll be able to hear this lecture eventually. It usually takes them a couple of weeks or so to get the lecture up. I also would really like to thank our sponsor for this evening. So we cannot do these lectures without our wonderful sponsors. And we have a great sponsor tonight. Our sponsor for the evening is the Montana NTRAC. So are there any members of the Montana NTRAC in the crowd? I know there's one way up in the back. Great, yay! So for those of you who don't know what Montana NTRAC is, it is actually a local nonprofit organization that promotes model railroading with an emphasis on the N scale model of the model train cars, as well as railroad history. You'll often see them set up at the Gallatin Valley Mall or the Gallatin History Museum. So if you are into model railroading, you are in luck because they are going to be set up at the Gallatin Valley Mall this weekend. They're going to be there on Saturday from, 9 to 7, and then on Sunday from 11 to 3. And so if you haven't had a chance to see them set up in the mall or at the museum, you should definitely go check it out because it is mesmerizing to watch this railroad and these trains going around the track. And the time and the effort that they put into this is just unbelievable. So I highly encourage you to go out, take a look. It's interesting for kids all the way through adults. So I encourage you to go out. If you would like to become a member of the Montana NTRAC group, there is a sign-up sheet on the table out, and you can sign up on your way out. You can put your email on, and they'll give you an email. Actually, Craig will send you an email. And they're looking for members for their group. And so if you're at all interested in that, put your name. Some mood lighting. Put your name on the sign-up sheet, and Craig will get in touch with you. I also wanted to mention one more thing before I turn it over to Dale. And what do you think, Angie? Okay. It's a little wavy, but one other thing I wanted to mention is that we have a presentation coming up next month that you don't want to miss on March 26th. And I wanted to mention it because the presentation coming up on March 26th is going to be a little different than our normal routine. It will be a panel discussion called The 19th Amendment, Expanding the Arc of the Suffrage Story. And just to give you a little background on this, a group of about 10 to 15 organizations from around Bozeman have come together and are committed to to commemorating the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but also to broadening the narrative of women's suffrage. We seek to recognize that while the 19th Amendment was a key achievement for white women's rights, many women of color were excluded from both the process and the outcomes of the fight for suffrage. So we are interested in recognizing the ongoing threats to voting rights within this as well. So that is what the panel is going to be discussing. Right now we're looking at about 4 experts in the field, and we're waiting for a confirmation from one of them, so I don't want to say who they are yet, but look, watch our website, watch our newsletter for information on who those 4 experts will be. We're going to do the panel discussion starting at 6:30, which is a little later than normal, but we're going to have a reception hosted by the Museum of the Rockies from 6 to 6:30. So come, have some reception, some drink and some food, and be able to talk to the panelists before the panel, and then the panel will last from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. So I hope you can join us for that, and make sure to come early and secure a seat, because it's probably going to be another packed house. So I am so excited tonight to introduce Dale Martin. Dale is an instructor at MSU's Department of History and Philosophy, and has recently focused on courses in the history of Montana and the West, the First World War, and 20th century Middle East. And I had an opportunity to sit in on Dale's History of Montana and the West course, and it was fabulous. I learned so much in that course. Dale has ridden and watched trains from Anaconda to Alice Springs. And he has recently published a book. And so we have his book out on the table. I don't know if there's any copies left, maybe only one copy left. So if you didn't, let's not stampede out, but if you want a copy, there is still one left, and Dale will be happy to sign it for you. So please join me in welcoming Dale Martin.
So I want to start off by asking all of you several questions. In your travels within Montana, as well as traveling out of Montana and back into Montana, first, how many of you have made those trips by airplane? Raise your hand. Okay, I'd say really close to almost all. How many of you have done it by bus? Greyhound, Rimrock, Jefferson Line. Okay. Single digits. How many of you traveled in or out of or within Montana by passenger train? Okay, that's like a third to a quarter. And how many of you, when you think about doing a trip, especially a fairly major trip, and I'm talking not about the destination, you think about the actual travel, how many of you look forward to traveling by public transport? Okay. This one, we'll come back to this. And one of my theses is that there's a relatively short time, probably in the middle of the 20th century, Americans, and I assume beyond the United States, actually look forward to getting on an airplane, a train, a ship, and maybe even intercity bus. But we'll come back to that. 110 years ago, you could start in any place, almost any place in Montana, hundreds of places, and from there you could get by public transportation to another place, perhaps equally remote. You could get from Freud, Montana, way up in the northeast to Lima, down in the southwest near the Idaho border. Now, it would take a while. There's transfers and layovers, but you could do it without owning your own vehicle. And it's been a long time since one could do that. And what we're looking at today is the rise of public transportation, its peak, and then its long decline. And so I want to start with a local train, a train that traveled on the Great Northern's main line between Williston, North Dakota, and Havre, Montana. It's now the main line of the BNSF Railway. But 100 years ago, on that main line, there were several mainline trains, Chicago, St. Paul, Seattle train. And they passed through many of the towns between the North Dakota border and Havre without stopping. So the Great Northern ran a local train, a train that trains left Havre and Williston in the morning and spent most of their traveling one west and one east until they reached their destination. And they stopped up to 61 times during that trip. This was a trip that was 309 miles long, and it took, if the train was on time, it took between 11 and a half and 12 hours. And they were they didn't stop. There were 61 places, towns, small cities, settlements. Some of them were just a telegraph station along the railway, or a base where the track workers lived in some small little tiny community. And at some of the stops at towns, there was a scheduled stop, but many of those stopping places were optional. They were called flag stops. And the way and they stopped only if there was a passenger who wanted to get on or off. If you were on the train and you wanted to get off, you went to the conductor or brakeman and told them, and they would signal the engineer with a communication cord to the locomotive that the train was stopped. If you wanted to get on the train, and this is long before, obviously, before reservations over telephone and computer, you actually stood by the track if there was a station or a platform, and as soon as you saw the locomotive come in sight, you made your presence clear. And the train would stop. And so this was a train, and the locals called this train the Skidoo. It's spelled like the snowmobile, Skidoo, only pronounced Skidoo. The westbound trains had numbers. All trains had numbers. The westbound train was numbered, originally it was 23, and then it became 223. 100 years ago, there was a phrase called 23 Skidoo, and it meant to leave quickly. And often it meant to leave in a hurry or leave trouble. Now, on the Skidoo that ran in on the Great Northern, you did not leave quickly. But the train number 23, someone matched that with the phrase 23 Skidoo. And so the local people called it the Skidoo. That name did not show up in the timetable or in any of the Great Northern literature. The same crew ran that, if not every day, most of each week. And they got to know the local passengers who would use it to go to the county seat, to go shopping in a market town, to visit family, whether it was a 5-mile trip or a 155-mile trip. And this was also on a section of line that you probably noticed, especially if you traveled up there, this was a section of the line that had all those foreign place names at a greater density, and there's no clear explanation of how they got it. If you rode the train its entire length, you'd go through places, and I'm going to try to pronounce them in their European pronunciation, but they were sometimes these pronunciations would be adapted and anglicized. Calais, Chelsea, Glasgow, Paisley, Tampico, Cork, Malta, Exeter, Coburg, Savoy, Madras, Zurich, and Havre. And there's several stories about how all those names got attached to the place, but the explanations I don't think are correct, and so we don't know. But it would take you through all those, and of those stops I named, only the main trains only stopped at 3 of those, at Glasgow, Malta, and Havre. And all the other places, if you wanted to get into that place or out of it by train, you had to ride the Skidoo. And here's how, at least for one person in Coburg, this is from a web contribution to a weblog by someone named Eva, and writing about the Second World War when there was rationing of gasoline to save tires. And so the trains during the Second World War saw more traffic than they had in the 1930s. At age 12, my sister became too old to ride the train for half fare. So being 3 years younger, I stepped into her job of going 11 miles from Coburg to Dodson. We're talking about west of Malta here, for the mail and any grocery item my parents might need. After walking northwest about a mile from our farm home to the Milk River, I stood on the wooden platform of the Great Northern Railway depot at the nearly deserted town of Coburg. On this day, when I was 9 years old, I knelt by the railroad track and put my ear to the rail. The distant sound of the steam locomotive echoed down the track. When I saw the locomotive emerge from around the bend to the west, I stood in the middle of the track and waving my arms up and down until the toot-toot assured me that I had been seen. As the steam locomotive pulling 2 cars came to a grinding stop, the conductor stepped down and placed a stool for me. As I stepped up, he gave his usual greeting. "How in the world are you?" He helped me into the train car. Holding out his hand, he took my 11 cents, a penny a mile, and I was off to Dodson. Getting off, and she had about 2 hours if the train was running, if it was on time. Getting off in Dodson Depot only minutes later, I crossed the railroad track and went south a block to the post office for the mail. I had 2 hours to make my purchases and even window shop at each of the 3 grocery and general merchandise stores in town before buying my homeward bound ticket for Mrs. Swetch, the depot agent. Getting aboard, I asked the conductor to let me off at the crossing west of the Coburg depot so I could walk across our alfalfa field to our farm and save a little walking time. He contacted the engineer and they obligingly stopped. Wow. Personalized transportation. Wow. This is long before Uber came around. But riding those trains, and many of the people who rode trains back 100 years ago, whether it's in Montana or in upstate Maine or down up in the Texas Panhandle, they did not ride the storied expresses with the dining cars in linen. They rode these local trains, 2, 3, 4 cars long, day coaches, red plush seating that apparently when it was really hot was really itchy, probably the floor stained with tobacco spit, although most trains had a smoker, which was a section of a railway car or a whole car, and that was where the men could smoke their cigars, that was where the traveling salesmen could tell their farmers' daughters jokes and tell them which is the best hotel in Havre and more. But these were not trains that were fun to ride. So this is from a novel by Sinclair Lewis, Elmer Gantry. And Sinclair Lewis grew up on the prairies of Montana at Sauk Center. He calls it Gopher Prairie in Main Street. And I expect this description is from his experience riding the Great Northern Railway west out of Minneapolis-St. Paul. And this is set in Kansas, but it could be in almost anywhere. They were on the 516 for Cato. The train consisted of a day coach, a combined smoker and baggage car, and a rusty old engine and tender. The train so on the rough tracks that it bumped through as it bumped through the drooping light, that Elmer and Jim were thrown against each other and gripped the arm of their seat. The car staggered like a freighter in a gale. The tall, raw farmers perpetually shuffling forward to a drink at the water cooler stumbled against them or seized Jim's shoulder to steady themselves. To every surface in the old smoking car, to streaked windows in rusty ironworks and mud-smeared coconut matting, clung a sickening bitterness of cheap tobacco fumes, and whenever they touched the red plush of the seat, dust whisked up, and the prints of their hands remained on the plush. The car was jammed. People came to sit on the arm of their seat to shout at their friends across the aisle. Not a lot of glamour there. So I want to briefly just talk about public transportation, a quick definition and some of the aspects of it. In the history of human transportation, which goes back thousands of years, the idea of public transportation is relatively new, probably for the most part, a few hundred years old. And so it's a small part, and as I'll say later on, I think in many parts of the world, and including Montana, it's fading, it's going away. And it can be divided into intercity transportation and urban transportation. But by public transportation, at least what I mean by it, is transportation that is open to the public. It's not operated by, say, for the employees of a certain company. for instance, or a certain group of people. If you're willing to abide by the circumstances, you can write it and pay a fare. It usually includes fixed routes, well-known, fixed schedules, published schedules, and fares that often are published as well, or you can find out ahead of time what the fare is. And so if you're willing to abide by their schedule and you have the money, you can ride. Now, in various situations, in areas where there is segregation, there might be limitations on that. And public transportation is, as I'll come back to later, is very expensive to operate. And so often public transportation came with the carriage of priority goods, the mail, for instance, whether it's U.S. mail or the Royal Mail or other national mail systems. That express was often combined with that, sometimes even perishables, money, and more. The name of the full name of the Titanic was RMS Titanic, Royal Mail Steamer Titanic. And without that mail contract, the Lusitanian, the Mauritanian, the Titanic perhaps could not have operated. So public transportation has often been regulated by the government for the safety and comfort of passengers and workers, as well as sometimes subsidized through mail contracts, for instance, or government express, or carrying government goods. Initially, public transportation was privately owned and operated. Stagecoach lines, city omnibus lines, railways, steamship lines, airlines were privately owned and operated. Again, sometimes with government regulation or subsidies. But in the 20th century, especially for land transportation, as automobiles became more common, along with improved public roads, there was more competition to public transportation, railways, and so often these operations started to lose money. And for many of the surviving public transportation, air transport aside, is now largely government-owned, whether that's urban transit systems, or whether it's the rail passenger systems in the United States and Canada, where we have Amtrak and Canada has VIA. They are government-owned, and they lose money. There's a saying in the railroad business anyway that any enterprise that is dedicated to carrying passengers is a money loser, unless you can get a great mail contract or a subsidy or something like that. Probably the first public transport goes back thousands of years, and that was the people who operated ferries across rivers, where the public needed to cross from one side of a major travel route, from one side of the river to another. But in terms of wheeled transportation, it goes back to the 1600s in Europe with stagecoaches, mail coaches, omnibuses, horse-pulled carriages, whether it was for urban transport or intercity transport in places like France and England. And so that's just a quick background on public transportation. And my thesis is public transportation is a recent phenomenon in the history of human travel and passenger travel, and that it reached its peak in Montana, throughout much of the rural United States, and I would guess even throughout the world in the early 20th century, at the height of railroad network and passenger transportation over that. And since the 1920s in the US, in Canada, in Montana, public transportation has been diminishing. Now, if you live in a place like Seattle or the Seattle-Portland corridor, that may not be evidence. But if you live in Lewistown, Montana, which has no public transportation, it's all too evident. And I'll come back to some of the reasons for that. But there are parts of Montana now, the public transportation, trying to get a scheduled ride in or out of towns, especially in central and eastern Montana. You had an easier time in 1883 than you do now getting a ride. And it's the chance of it improving is nil. And so that's much of what policy is going to be in that. In the time period between 1910 and 1920, railroads in the United States and Canada carried more, provided a wider range of services, transportation and associated communication service than any single mode of transportation before or since. And so that would include horse-pulled transportation before, it would include automobiles and trucks since then. And if you looked at the range of transportation communications that railroads did in 1915, for instance, and now look at the range of modes of transportation that do the same services that was all combined into railroads, you would be looking at private automobiles, you'd be looking at trucks, both privately owned and commercially operated, you'd be looking at buses, both intercity and commuter buses, you'd be looking at airplanes for long distance travel, you'd be looking at the trucks that are parked and stopped in front of your house, that UPS truck or that FedEx truck. 100 years ago, that would have been a horse-pulled carriage, or perhaps a truck with Railway Express Agency written across the door. And so what railroads provided then in the range of services and the extent of the number of communities they reached is now done by a whole variety of commercial and private vehicles and enterprises. And railroads in Montana in 1915 reached more places, hundreds of places, than were reached before then by steamboats or stagecoaches and have been reached since then. Now, it wasn't that there was great service, but as covered, it wasn't always comfortable in that sense. So just how many places in Montana were reached by railroads where the trains stopped? It's hundreds, and I did not look at 42 timetables and count every stop on those timetables. But here's some clues. In 1920, report of the 1920 census by the U.S. government, there were 107 formally incorporated under state law, towns and cities in Montana. That ranged from all the big ones like Great Butte and Great Falls, down to the smallest of these was Hingham, west of Havre on the High Line on US 2 on the Great Northern. Of those 107 towns, 105 had railway service, passenger trains. There were only 2 towns on that list that did not have railway, and they never did. One was Ekalaka, of course, far eastern Montana, and the other was Virginia City, which never actually had a railroad. But 98 to 99% of those towns, and those railroads also served hundreds of other communities that weren't unincorporated towns like Logan, Ringling, Salesville, present-day Gallup Gateway, Trident, Toston, Willow Creek. So hundreds of those small towns, community settlements were served, as well as hundreds of railway stops, isolated telegraph stations away from population centers. Those telegraphers needed a way to get to and from their job when they had a break or a vacation. And hundreds of track mates, section bases where the track workers, often immigrants, lived in a little community on the track side. And so that those 61 stops that the Skidoo had between Williston and Havre, some of those were full-fledged towns like Wolf Point or Malta, some were smaller communities, some was just a telegraph station, a water tank, and a track workers base. So how many towns in Montana now have regular scheduled public transport? 42. 13 towns are served by air, and over half of those are government subsidized flights, and I'll come back to that in a bit, the essential air service towns. Amtrak serves 11 towns in northern Montana, 3 of which also have air service. And then there's 21 towns in Montana that have bus service. And basically, those are out in western Montana. There's between Whitefish and Missoula, and from Great Falls south through Helena Butte down to the Idaho border. Not surprisingly, the central and eastern part of Montana there's only 9 towns in that 3/5 of Montana that have public transportation on the High Line and on the I-94 route. And so that's what Montana has lost. And I would assume for most states east of the Cascades and Sierra Nevadas until you start to hit the Mississippi River, there would be similar stories for those States. So, if almost all of you raised your hand back when asked about airplanes. You know about airplanes and air travel. You know about airports because you have to. And if you look out there and you see a twin-engine turboprop waiting for your plane, as the planes to Seattle used to be until very recently, you know there's a certain kind of ride ahead of you. Cascade's actually going to give you a free beer. Not Cascade, but Horizon's going to give you a free beer. They've switched to jets now, and they don't give free beer anymore. But you know about airlines. You know about it because you have to. And people used to, when people went to a train station 100 years ago, they knew the same equivalent kind of thing about trains. They knew if they were going to Spokane, they'd be on a certain kind of train as opposed to going to Logan for a quick turnaround. And so I want to just quickly run over the types of trains that people rode, and the ones that get a lot of attention, starting with those, and the ones that don't get attention. And again, I'll start off by saying each pair of trains is numbered. Generally, the premier pair of trains on any railroad was numbered 1 and 2. One would be westbound, 2 would be eastbound. And on the premier trains, they had names as well, officially assigned names that showed up in the timetable. And some of the great trains that ran through Montana, especially on the east-west routes, were the trains like the Oriental Limited and the Empire Builder up on the Great Northern Line, the High Line, and Amtrak still calls their train the Empire Builder, the Glacier Park Limited. On the Northern Pacific Line that ran through Bozeman and through Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula, there was the North Coast Limited for 71 years. You could go down to the station on Front Street in northeast Bozeman and get on one of the best trains in the country in terms of service, in terms of equipment, and reputation. From 1900 until Amtrak came into existence in 1971. On the Milwaukee line through more of the central portion of the state on an east-west route, you had the Olympian Hiawatha, the Columbia. And if you wanted to head south out of Butte, you took the Butte Special to Pocatello, Ogden, and Salt Lake City. These trains were a full-length train, 10, 12 cars long, would be as long as an ocean liner. And it would have almost all the services of an ocean liner, except it had to fit in cars that were 10 feet wide. So it was much more compact than the Queen Mary or the Mauritania. And so I just want to run through what was on that train. Stopped, headed west out of Bozeman, the North Coast Limited or the Pacific Express or the Northern Pacific. You have a steam locomotive, we're talking about, say, 1920, steam locomotive at the front. The cars right behind the steam locomotive were called head-end cars. These were the non-passenger cars. They would carry, that's where the baggage would be carried, that's where the express, the Railway Express Agency or the Northern Pacific Express was carried, and the U.S. mail. In fact, there was actually a post office in one of those cars, a railway post office. It had all the fittings of a post office, all those pigeonholes for sorting letters and mail. They could cancel mail. They could sell stamps during stops. They picked up and dropped off mail, both when the train was stopped at stops, and they picked up and dropped it off when the train was moving. If you were in a town like Belgrade, when it was a small town and the North Coast Limited went through it 40 miles an hour. There was a steel crane outside next to the track, a big steel crane with arms. The postal employee would bring a canvas bag with loops on each end and put it over the ends of these extended arms, and then when the train came through, a steel arm came out from the side of the train, snagged that canvas bag and pulled it in. And that's how the westbound mail would leave Belgrade. And at the same time, out another door, a postal employee would kick off a canvas bag with the outgoing mail. And thousands of communities throughout the United States, small towns where the expresses did not stop. And that's how 2, 4, 6 times a day the mail would leave town. And so that railway post office car, when it was stopped in Bozeman, if you wanted to get something out on time, right on time, you could go up to the station on the northeast part of town, And on the side of the car was a little letter slide. Pull a little cover down, drop your letter inside, put it up. They would cancel it, they'd sort it, and it was going to head towards Portland, it was going to head towards Spokane, and they would cancel it with a special cancellation. And you would know in 10 minutes your mail was on its way, and it would probably get to Spokane faster in 1950 than it does now. Because now that mail is, you drop it in the mailbox or at the slot in the downtown, it is flown to Billings. And it goes through an automatic optical sorter there and then is put on another airplane and flown west. So mail moved fast in many, especially along main lines. Mail moved faster 100 years ago than it does now. So these were the premier trains. And you had the head-end cars, and then you had coaches, followed that. Day coaches that were for short passengers making short trips. Ultimately, there'd be coaches with leg rests for people who were overnight. The middle part of the train would have the food service. There'd be a dining car, maybe a lounge car as well. And then you'd have the sleeping cars at the back. In 100 years ago, there would have been both compartment sleeping cars, little roomettes, but there were also berths that folded down, and you'd sleep on a berth with a heavy brown curtain, a heavy fabric curtain holding you in. And you had to climb up a little, for the upper berth, you climbed up a little ladder to get there. And then in the back of the premier trains would be the observation car with an open platform. And you've probably seen pictures of politicians speaking with that brass railing. You know, Teddy Roosevelt leaning over. And that was on the back end of a lot of trains. And you could sit back there on a warm day and watch the track recede behind you. So those were the premier trains. These are the ones that there's picture books written about them. They get featured probably in films and reminiscence that were and some of them even required an extra fare. But most people did not ride them. They rode the secondary train on that route. It was a little slower. It didn't have quite the amenities. They rode secondary routes, Billings to Omaha. These were trains that were shorter. And for instance, an example would be from Billings to Denver, run by the Burlington route. And this was a train that had a short-lived name, the Shoshone, but in the 1950s, it had a different name. It crossed through southern Wyoming at night, both the north and southbound trains, and it was called the Nightcrawler. And that was at least the name of the train. And again, it never showed up in timetables, but that was what local people called it. And that, again, that's mostly what a lot of people rode, not the premier trains. And then finally you had the locals, like the Skidoo, that stopped or could stop, depending on demand, every 5 miles or so, as they averaged 20 miles an hour throughout much of the day. And these often did have other names. There was one in eastern Washington called, the locals called it the Sage Hen. So I want to give an example of a trip that one person could take. This is I took someone who actually lived in Bozeman, and a woman named Edith Luther, who she graduated with a degree in chemistry from Montana State College in 1917 at the age of 31, a non-traditional student. She was from Shodo, where her family lived. She lived in a house on 409 South Grand, just north of what people now call the Julia Martin House. It was a boarding house. She was a roomer at the boarding house. And so what we're going to do is we're going to follow her on how she would have gotten from that house to her parents in Shodo, the range of transportation services. If you go to that, the house is still there, and it's actually there's a sign in front that says it's got 6 units in it. It's not a rooming house per se, but an apartment house, literally, in that sense. If you go stand out in front of South Grand Avenue, the pavement in front of that house, and you look in the center of the pavement, it's got corrugated pavement. That is because the cross ties of the Bozeman Street Railway, the electric railway, are still under that pavement. The rail was pulled up in 1922, and the railway was abandoned. The ties are still there, and the pavement has slowly settled between the ties. And you can actually see where they had to cut the pavement to pull out the rails and then repave, but you can still see the lines. It's especially effective if it's just rained and there's little parallel puddles. So she could, in this event, she could have left her rooming house at 409 South Grand and literally stopped flight down a streetcar. Now the train she's taking leaves Bozeman at 5:20 in the morning, so I'm not actually sure that the streetcars ran that early, but for a better, more central daytime departure time, she could have literally walked 40 feet, hailed a streetcar that would run her through downtown out to the train station that still stands, boarded up on North Front Street. So there was a train that, this is 1916-17, that left Bozeman at 5:20, and it was one of these mainline passenger trains, St. Paul to Seattle, Tacoma, and it would take 3 hours and 25 minutes to do the 98 miles to Helena. And then she'd have 2 hours, 15 minutes in Helena. She'd have to go from the NP station on the east side of Helena to the Great Northern Station on the north edge, but there was a streetcar line. And so she could take that, but she could create, there was a lunchroom in the NP station. She could maybe get a quick lunch in the NP station before going to the GN station. And then getting on a train that would take her from Helena to Great Falls, 3 hours and 20 minutes for 99 miles. This would take her through the Prickly Pear Canyon. If you take I-15 north, you go through it. You may have noticed there's a railway line there. It's out of use now, but that's the line she would have taken. That would have taken her to Great Falls, to the Great Northern Station there. She'd have a short layover. She could go out and maybe go around and look at the octagonal tower that rises high above the roof of the Great Northern Station. And then get on a mixed train that would carry her from Great Falls to Shoto, 59 miles. And at 59 miles, it would take 3 hours. This mixed train was basically a freight train with a passenger car, a combination baggage express coach at the back end. And it would stop. It would not only drop off passengers express, but it might shift cars at a coal yard and do that business. It would be the only, except during harvest season, it was probably the only train, the only pair of trains that ran on that line. And she would get in, if everything ran on time, she would get into Shoto at 6 o'clock in the evening. This was a trip of about 285 miles that took her 12 hours and 40 minutes. I don't know how much it cost. The timetables don't list fares, but it cost less than 3 cents a mile because in 1905, the Montana state government, which could regulate intrastate traffic, passed a law saying that the rails could not charge more than 3 cents a mile for their basic coach ticket. So if they charged 3 cents a mile, it would be about $7.50. But she had an extra advantage as a Montana State College student. In 1917, the Montana State Legislature passed a bill that said anyone who was enrolled in the Montana public system of higher education, which would include Missoula, Bozeman, Dillon, and Butte, they could, once a year, if their train trip home cost more than, round trip cost more than $5, the state would refund them for that trip. So the state would pay for one trip home.
Wow.
So that is an example of public transportation. Slow, perhaps, maybe not all that comfortable. No such, air conditioning was opening the window a little bit farther, and that would bring in more soot and cinders, depended on what kind of coal the locomotive was burning and how good the fireman was. But if it was casting out a lot of things, then it could be, by the end, you could feel really sooty on the ride. Passenger transportation, public transportation, is very expensive to operate. It involves vehicles, airplanes, ships, boats, trains, buses that are expensive to acquire, and because they move, they require there's a tentative maintenance if you're going to keep them operating in good order. If you're a railroad or a canal in the early stages, you have to build the right-of-way for your transport. If you're a bus company or an airline,
The bus companies can use public roads, the airlines use open skies. But if you're a railroad, you have to build, maintain, and pay property taxes on that rail line, which may have a right-of-way anywhere from 75 to 400 feet wide. You need terminals. You need huge urban terminals, whether it's a grand train station or an airport or a seaside docking area for the steamship. And then for railroads, you need hundreds of intermediate stations where people can buy tickets, can check their luggage, can pick up their luggage, and it's very labor intensive. You need people to operate the vehicles, you need people to maintain them, to maintain the right-of-way, you need clerks, and if you're serving meals on board your vehicle or you're offering sleeping accommodations, you need porters and laundry, you need to run a laundry establishments, you need to have commissaries for the dining car. And when railroads had little competition before automobiles and improved public roads came along, they could make money on passenger trains with those mail cars. But once the automobiles came on, the tremendous investment that public transport required in fixed properties and moving properties and labor meant that they almost inevitably lost money, even with the express and mail. And by the mid 20th century, many of the railroads wanted out of the passenger business. For one thing, you can ship a crate of something in a boxcar and it won't complain. If it's running late, if it's hot, this sort of thing. But if a passenger is hot and running late, they're going to complain. They're going to complain to the crew, they're going to write a letter to the head office. And so railroads in the 50s and 60s started thinking, this passenger business is a real hassle, especially away from the main lines. And so they started trying to get out of it. It meant that initially, until 1962, they had to go to the states and get permission to abandon service. They had to prove that there were alternates available, buses, or that hardly they could show low ridership numbers and more. But before that happened, and this goes back to that question I asked you, I think there was a decade and a half in the 1960s plus or minus that was the golden age of travel. That's when, and I think probably many of you probably remember this. I remember it as a kid, looking forward to a family trip, getting on a train with a dining car and a dome car, getting on an airplane when airplanes were 707s were really exciting, even a 747. It was exciting. Before deregulation, carriers had to compete on service. They couldn't compete on price because that was regulated. So they had to compete on service, friendliness of the workers, and food and more. I think one of the things that killed the fun of traveling was deregulation. When the prices dropped and people said, I don't care what the food is like, I just want a cheap ride. And so I think that and other factors did a lot to take the fun out of traveling. But there were other factors as well, of course. And one of them was, of course, the automobile. Or, as one of the salesmen in the opening of a music band said when they're talking about how the set in 1912, how their trade of traveling salesman is changing. And one of them says it's that Model T Ford that made the trouble, made the people want to get up and go 10, 12, 14, 22, 23 miles to the county seat. Yes, sir. And people, the automobile still does advantages that the train could never meet. With an automobile, you can go when you want to, you can take that stop when you want to, you can take a side trip, you don't have to wonder who's going to be sitting next to you, and you don't have to pack very carefully. You can just throw stuff in the back seat, and you don't have to worry about, is this going to fit the overhead thing? And so automobiles, and that's often credited, but I think without massive government spending on roads, country roads, crowned gravel roads to interstates. Without that, the car would not have had the appeal. And so as the combination of the automobile, increasingly reliable tires that could go for months without a flat tire, that was a wonder. You know, and I remember talking to some people from the South. They said, you know what made cars popular in the South and took people away from passenger trains? When they put air conditioning in cars. And if you had to go from Cincinnati to New Orleans in the summer and without air conditioning in your car, you might take the Louisville and Nashville Hummingbird instead. But once you could get that Pontiac with air conditioning, you were good. And so as public transportation options faded, offerings faded, governments had various responses. So when airlines were deregulated in the Carter administration, late 70s, and the government, U.S. government knew that once the airlines were relieved of many of their obligations that came with regulation, they would stop serving the smaller cities. Why run planes to Havre when you could put that on a Southern California route? So the government created the Essential Air Service, which funneled money to airlines and now that just serve. So Montana has 7 of these towns: Havre, Glasgow, Wolf Point, Sydney, Glendive, West Yellowstone in the summer, and even Butte, that only have air service because the government stepped in, realizing that it would take government subsidies. And these subsidies run to $2 million a year for each of those places. That they stopped running to Lewistown a couple of years ago because the average subsidy for every passenger that got on or off a plane in Lewistown was over $2,000. And so, but anyway, the U.S. government recognized we need to preserve this network of air travel for people. When the passenger trains were fading, the freight railroads wanted to get rid of them in the United States and Canada. The government in both those countries created systems to take up preserve much of the network. Amtrak in the United States in 1971, and then 6 years later, VIA for Canada. And they both still exist. They've shrunk since their creation. And so by the 1970s, for thousands of towns around the United States, dozens of towns in Montana, the last existing transportation was the intercity bus, Greyhound or Trailway. And starting in 2004, Greyhound started skipping stops, not stopping in Big Timber and Drummond anymore, just stopping in the larger cities. And now Greyhound's gone from the state. There are replacement lines, but they're less stable. There have been several transfers. Greyhound Canada, about 2 years, a year and a half ago, announced that they had an extensive network through the prairie provinces of Canada up into the North Country, the forested areas. They announced in October 2018 they were going to end all bus service in 3 provinces: Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and parts of BC. Hundreds of towns lost their last public transportation. And just an odd connection, the school buses that you see on Bozeman that say First Student on the side, they are owned by the same company that runs Greyhound US and Canada. It's based in Aberdeen, Scotland. It's called First Group. So when you see that First Student bus, the head office for that bus is in Aberdeen. And you can imagine that the managers in Aberdeen probably aren't all that concerned about whether towns in Alberta have bus service. And Saskatchewan, which had a somewhat socialist government for many years, had its own provincially run bus service, Saskatchewan Transportation Service. In 2017, the conservative government of Canada shut that down. And so again, dozens of towns lost their last transportation. And the issue of rural transportation, or the lack of rural transportation throughout Canada and the United States, and I think it's not just Canada and the United States. There's places like rural northern England, Northumberland and Cumberland are losing their bus services. Rural France is part of the anger of the yellow vests or the yellow jackets that you probably have seen the protests of, was the loss of services to rural and small town France. As the government under Macron has cut budgets, preserving making more effort to preserve social services, government services for the urban areas than for the rural areas. And so these communities have lost, over the past decades, they've lost civil institutions, schools have been consolidated, the students may not be bused to a town 20 miles away, to a consolidated thing. The post office may survive. Every now and then there's talk of cutting up to a third to a half of the rural post offices. A lot of towns don't have any emergency services, law enforcement, fire, or ambulances. Those have been reduced. And retail, grocery stores, hardware, gasoline, getting fuel for your vehicle are disappearing. And medical services. Some people now live 50, 60 miles from a doctor or a dentist or a veterinarian. And so this loss of transportation is part of a much larger issue for rural. And this public transportation problem even goes to school buses. School buses have been part of, it is public transportation. It's limited to school as children, but they're very extensive networks. And article by the political columnist for the United States in the Economist magazine, he wrote about Fort Wayne, Indiana, that's talking about cutting their school bus system. And he says that it's more that this is reflects a larger issue. He wrote, these bus cuts were more than a local drama. Look closely, and Fort Wayne's woes point to a larger debate about how to pay for and supply public services. He concludes with Fort Wayne's bus crisis is surely fixable. Indiana passed rigid tax cuts without pondering the trade-offs that might follow. The school district is wedded to a business model that involves owning hundreds of its yellow buses. America used to excel at finding practical solutions to such puzzles. Not anymore. So what about the loss of passenger, we'll go back to passenger trains. What about the loss? Obviously the range of opinions. There are people who are directly affected when that daily train isn't stopping anymore, providing service for 10 miles or 1,000 miles. But obviously there's the range of views. Here are two quotes from a man named Doug Young. He was transport minister for Canada in the government of Jean Chrétien. This was in the mid-90s under the Liberal government. Liberal in Canada means center-right. Trudeau is in the Liberal Party. And he was transport minister, but he had no interest. Most transport cabinet members who are in charge of transportation are just waiting for a real cabinet post to open up. They can actually have a serious job like treasurer of state or something like that. So one of his quotes is, "The national dream of iron horses, steel rails, and steam is dead." Now, steam had been dead for a long time, but and then he wrote of VIA, the government-run passenger trains. He said, "They don't get my heart going pity-pat." So people who wanted Canada's passenger trains back then didn't have a lot of hope, thinking that the government was going to care. On the other end, you have the rail enthusiasts who rode trains, who photographed them, and more. This is a caption from a picture book of railroads in Idaho, Washington, Oregon area, and it's a picture of a classic steam locomotive pulling a short passenger train into Lewiston, Idaho. And here is the cry of the heart that followed the details. Such scenes were once commonplace before the incursion of an age of psychopathic confusion, completely devoid of aesthetics, destroyed the beauty that once was. He did not take it well. So what would it take? You've probably thought it, you've probably heard people say, I wish we in America, maybe not Montana, we had a rail passenger system like when I went to Czechoslovakia, or when I was in Korea, or when I went to China, or I did that trip to the Arctic Circle in Norway. I wish we had that. What would it take for us to get that here? And one would be the political will for a government, and a government would only do that if there was a popular will. Where people said, we'll pay more tax if it goes to a passenger system. So that's one aspect. Another would probably be if gas prices tripled. That might, at least for a fair time. And the other thing that would help is if we had as many people in Montana as Germany, which is slightly smaller in area in Montana, had. And that's 83 million. If 83 million people lived in Montana, we would have a great transportation system. So take Norway. Norway is almost exactly the same area as Montana, 148,000 square miles. Norway has 5.5 million people, which is about 5 times our population. Gas in Norway costs the equivalent of $7 a gallon. But I think more than that, Norwegians have a very different view of what government is for in terms of social services, beyond defending the realm, beyond enforcing the law. So I think there's so much that has to be changed. I want to finish with 3 stories. We'll go back to better times. I assume a large number of you used to watch Chet Huntley on the news. For you young ones, front, Chet Huntley was co-anchor for NBC, one of the, back when there were just 3 networks. And he hosted the news with David Brinkley. And Chet Huntley, his father was a telegrapher for the Northern Pacific Railway. He was born in the railway station. Those small railway stations as living quarters at Cardwell, which is just a little bit, there's a little community there. It's a little bit east of Whitehall along the Jefferson River. But his father was a telegrapher on weekends when there was less traffic on the line. Then he could listen in on the news that was traveling on the thing, and he could follow, for instance, games. And if there was a major World Series, a prize fight, he could follow that. And this is how Chet Huntley wrote about his first broadcast experience. My first experience in mass communications came as a result of Dad's trade as a telegrapher. On the days of a World Series game, if it was Saturday or Sunday, Dad would write down the play-by-play reports as they came over the wire. A cluster of people would gather in the waiting room of the station, and I would bellow through the ticket window the play-by-play action. Express. Lots of things were carried by express. Valuables, money. That's why people robbed trains, because that's where the money was. Coffins traveled by express. Cans of milk go into a local creamery. One of the things that traveled by express was laundry. College students would send their laundry home to their parents by railway express, and then they would be sent back. And larger things, hotels would send large containers of laundry, large canvas hampers, put them on express cars and ship them to a commercial laundry. So a hotel in Shelby might send all its laundry to a big commercial laundry in Great Falls. So here's a quote from a novel set in Iowa in the early 1900s about a young man who sends his laundry home. And then his mother does the laundry and sends it back. And so the battered laundry case had been going back and forth between town and college until all the baggage men knew it by sight. Mrs. Ferguson never sent it back without tucked-in presents of cake and nuts and fried chicken, carefully done in her funny little amateur packages so that Carl's clean shirts wouldn't smell of food. And riding the train, some people probably were pretty oblivious, but some paid attention. So this is a passage from Eudora Welty, is one of the great Southern writers, of the 20th century. She grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. Her father was an insurance executive in Jackson, and he traveled a lot as part of his job. And so she rode with him sometimes. So she writes in a memoir about riding the train with her father. He wasn't a railroader, he's an insurance man, but the attention he paid. I had a window seat. Beside me, my dad checked the progress of our train by moving his finger down the timetable and springing open his pocket watch. He explained to me what the position of the arms of the semaphore, signals with arms that went up and down, before we were to pass through a switch, and he would watch the signal lights change. Along the track, the mileposts could be read, he read them. Right on time, my daddy's watch, the next town sprang into view, and just as quickly was gone. Side by side and separately, we each lost ourselves in the experience of not missing anything, of seeing everything, of knowing each time what the blows of the whistle meant. And then she writes about, after dinner in the dining car, they went to the back platform of the observation car. My father and I walked back to the open-air observation platform at the end of the train and sat on the folding chairs placed at the railing. We watched the sparks we made fly behind us into the night. Fast as our speed was, it gave us time enough to see the rose-red cinders turn to ash, each one, and disappear from sight. Departures and arrivals. Many, many young people left for college, for military service, for a job from the train station, on a train with family watching. This is Hal Borland, who in the 50s, 60s, 70s was a well-known nature writer, wrote a lot about animals. He grew up in a small town, Flagler, Colorado, on the high plains of northeastern Colorado, on the Rock Island main line to Colorado Springs and Denver. And he's taking the train, he's finished high school, and he's heading off to the rest of his life. I stood in the vestibule for a last look, first to the north at Flagler slipping past, then to the south, out to the old flats that had been the frontier, and were now just the high plains, where a new breed of men were plowing the grass and fencing the wind, or trying to, and making memories of yesterday, the legends of tomorrow. Then the porter took my suitcase and led me to my seat. The locomotive far up there ahead whistled a long screaming blast for the crossing a mile east of town. Then we flashed past the old tattered cottonwood that was the only reminder of the store and post office called Bowserville. On towards Seabird, Stratton, Burlington, Goodland, east toward tomorrow, whatever and wherever it might be. And I want to finish with a return. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's from almost at the end of The Great Gatsby. And the narrator is talking, this is an elite class, his narrator is talking about returning home from a prep school in the east to his home in Minnesota. And I assume this experience is very much like what Scott Fitzgerald experienced in the same situation. Christmas time, and the story starts in Chicago at the Union Station. They're riding on the Milwaukee Road, which of course was built and extended through Montana as well. So, at last, the Chicago Union Station. At last, the murky yellow cars of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway, looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate. When we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp wild brace suddenly into the air. We were unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it again. That's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost sweet towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth, and the street lamps and sleigh bells in the frosty dark, and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow.